From the News Channel 5 Network, this is MorningLine with Nick Barris.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us on MorningLine. And Nick Barris here on a Tuesday. Hope you'll join our program this morning and even join in the conversation. We'll get the phone number up there. A lot going on, as you might have noticed, in Washington, D.C., as there always is. And we've got these January 6th hearings happening. There was one yesterday, and I think many of our News Channel 5 viewers watched. Others were quite frustrated that we didn't have The Price is Right and Talk of the Town, which I understand. Those are great shows, and we're sorry you missed them. They'll be back on again today, but there will be another hearing, I believe, tomorrow at 9 o'clock. So these are some morning ones, so we'll have to preempt some of the programs just to give you a heads up on that. But we thought we would talk a little bit this morning about these hearings. Get the larger picture, get into some of that about what they ultimately mean down the road. We'll talk about some of the details that have been brought up, if you happen to catch some of it. Also, former President Trump issued a 12-page rebuttal to the testimony. We can talk a little bit about what he's saying about what we've seen. And as I said, like to get some of your phone calls. If you have a thought on what you've taken away from it, 615-773-7587, if you want to join in the conversation. But joining me this morning from MTSU is Professor John Weil. It's good to have him on. We always talk a little bit of politics and history and things like that. Good morning to you, Professor Weil.
Good morning.
Nice to have you on. And yeah, I guess the next hearing will be tomorrow. I think all told, did they say there would be 5 or 6? All within the next couple of weeks. I think the last one to wrap things up again will be on prime time, but I think the rest will be more morning hearings. Tomorrow, I think it starts at 9 o'clock.
I believe that's right.
Yeah. And
I sort of cut my teeth in graduate school, or maybe it's the end of undergraduate, on the Watergate hearings, and it's what they say, deja vu all over again.
I hear you. And I mean, some people may be too young to remember those hearings and the like, but different issue at hand, of course, there. But with this, talk maybe a bit about historically these types of hearings. You mentioned Watergate as being one such type hearing where they looked into things. On this one, I would imagine, there are similarities, there are differences. What hits you as you watch these January 6th hearings?
Well, one of the fascinating things about congressional hearings is there's not a specific provision in the Constitution that says Congress can have hearings. And of course, in the early republic, they wouldn't have been televised. But Congress has the power, of course, to make law. And in many ways, I think the most important thing about this hearing is not so much identifying what may have gone wrong, and particularly what Trump might have done wrong, where he did so, but is there legislation that might be necessary to prevent a repeat of what's happening? And one proposal, for example, is to, not that it needs clarification, but maybe we should have a provision specifically stating that the task of the vice president when he counts the electoral college votes is a ministerial duty rather than, an exercise of his own judgment. And there's some similar provisions that could come out of this.
And you also wonder, politics always play a role to some degree as well. I think it's certainly worth looking back and seeing how things played out. And I found much of the testimony fascinating. The president, former President Trump, came out with a 12-page rebuttal. I think we were talking a bit about that before the program. Certainly he's been paying attention to this. And when we talk about politics of this, he now accuses the Democrats of seeking to distract from a series of domestic issues facing the country by doing such a thing. And there's no doubt the Democrats maybe can appreciate the fact that, this is something that's maybe taking away from, inflation and gas prices,
Sure.
Even though I think we all notice that. But on the other hand, the rest of his rebuttal, he continues to repeat what is no doubt been lies, and yet there are still some people out there that think he won the election.
Right. To me, the most fascinating part about the hearing yesterday, and it wasn't necessarily new, but I think it has sort of gotten lost, was the accusation that Trump seems to have been raising money, to contest the election, and the money was actually $250 million, which is, not small change. that this actually went elsewhere. And I thought the most interesting part of Trump's, attempted rebuttal was accusing Zuckerberg, I guess it was, of taking money for one thing and using it for another, and then saying that, he needs to be put in jail. And it's like, if you're not careful, you may be putting a nail in your own coffin.
Yeah, right. Talk about that, because I remember all this money was being raised, constant ads being put out to continue to say, look, we need you to give money. And these are small dollar donors. These are,
Yes.
people who supported him that are on budgets, that have low incomes, that are sending him $10, $15, $20 saying, I need your money so that we can continue these legal challenges, of which they lost all of them to the election results. And yet now we're hearing that a very, very small portion of any of that money raised actually went to that. And I feel bad for the people who gave the money.
I do too.
I don't know. And yet many of them I can think, and there's probably some watching, and there's certainly still many Trump supporters would say, either they don't believe everything they're hearing or are glad they did. But I mean, it's almost as though you're in denial. Like, okay, so he didn't use the money, what he said. Are you still okay with that?
Yeah. And one of the problems, one of the reasons that politics seems to be veering off both to to the right and to the left is fundraising. And it pushes the fundraising. Each letter that you get, or each email that you get, or each tweet makes it sound as though the apocalypse is just around the corner. And if you don't give now, you might lose the republic. And so it's driven on both extremes. For the Democrats, Trump is the devil. For the Republicans, it's Pelosi and Clinton and whoever else. But it's a disturbing trend. The one other thing that I might say about the hearings this year it's a little disturbing, but I don't know what can be done about it. Past hearings have seemed a little bit more like you get people there and they're hearing them for the first time. And this hearing, so much of it has already come out that it almost seems more like an indictment than it does an investigation.
Yeah, and I think some have said, the Republicans who are defending, the way things played out to some degree, that, there's been not a lot new here. Certainly, the basics are pretty much the same. We've heard it. But at the same time now, hearing some of those who were closest to the president the day this happened, and seeing some of the video, never before seen video, or hearing firsthand from, say, for instance, that one Capitol police officer who testified, really hits home for you. But that's just it. You have his defenders saying, well, this isn't fair. The Democrats are putting on this show. And yet what we're hearing from is Bill Barr and so many others who are all Republicans who were part of this tight clique that day, saying these things. And it's kind of like, it's not like Democrats saying them, it's these Republicans who are saying them that were asked questions, part of this investigation.
And of course, part of what's happening here, in my judgment, the Republicans made an error, because the hearing initially was pretty much equal or relatively equal number of Democrats and Republicans. Pelosi rejected two of the Republican nominees who, frankly, would have been, just sort of bulldogs, that they would not have been looking for the truth. But as a consequence, the Republicans basically said, well, we're not going to have anybody. And so you get Cheney and Kissinger, who are, they're Republicans, but they're clearly not Trumpites. So the Republicans are now claiming that it's one-sided, but it's one-sided in part because they didn't play at the beginning in a way that could have put some of their people who might have a different opinion on the committee.
Yeah. And so I see that. When you look at the breakdown of the community, it's predominantly Democrats. So I see where they're drawing on it. But again, I go back to this point, almost all of the testimony in the interviews, are from Republicans or staffers who were right there or were very close to Donald Trump, talking about how they all saw the election results for what it was, and for whatever reason it was, the president, and who knows deep down what it really was, and he continues to stand by it. And I believe this is something that he was taught very early as a young man by his father. You know, you've read stories about it from the very beginning that he was told,
Yes.
you know, do what you think's right, stick with it, and even if it's wrong, even in the face of overwhelming indications that it's wrong, you just stick to your guns regardless. And that seems to be what he's doing. I mean, I find it hard to believe that anyone can truly, based on what we've heard, really think that he won. Even he. And yet he's sticking to that narrative because that's just the way he rolls.
Yeah, he doesn't. And of course, losing an election doesn't mean you're a loser. But I think that's how he perceives. He can have, how could he have, how could I, Donald Trump, have lost? I'm a billionaire. I'm a success. Who could not want me as president? So it is hard to figure out, does he believe it or, can he just not accept it? I don't know.
Yeah, we may never get the answer to that. Listen, we'll take a break. We'll take some phone calls, James and others, if you're on the hold. 737-7587. Your takeaway from it, one way or the other. You may think it's a bunch of hooey and not buy much into it. You may be someone who say, yeah, this is eye-opening and it's a stark reminder of, the horrible thing that did happen on January 6th. And defenders of what happened at the Capitol just don't got a lot of use for you. We'll take a break. We'll be back with more right after this.
Premature